Chapter 7, Part 2 of The Worst Journey in the World, by Apsley Cherry-Garrard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7, The Winter Journey, Part 2. That day we made 3¼ miles, and travelled 10 miles to do it. The temperature was -66 when we camped, and we were already pretty badly iced up. That was the last night I had written slept, in my big reindeer bag without the lining of eiderdown which we each carried. For me it was a very bad night, a succession of shivering fits which I was quite unable to stop, and which took possession of my body for many minutes at a time, until I thought my back would break, such was the strain placed upon it. They talk of chattering teeth, but when your body chatters you may call yourself cold. I can only compare the strain to that which I have been unfortunate enough to see in a case of lockjaw. One of my big toes was frostbitten, but I do not know for how long. Wilson was fairly comfortable in his smaller bag, and Bowers was snoring loudly. The minimum temperature that night as taken under the sledge was -69°, and as taken on the sledge was -75°, that is 107 degrees of frost. We did the same relay work on July 1st, but I found the pulling still harder, and it was all that we could do to move the one sledge forward. From now onwards Wilson and I, but not to the same extent Bowers, experienced a curious optical delusion when returning in our tracks for the second sledge. I have said that we found our way back by the light of a candle, and we found it necessary to go back in our same footprints. These holes became to our tired brains not depressions but elevations, hummocks over which we stepped, raising our feet painfully and draggingly. And then we remembered and said what fools we were, and for a while we compelled ourselves to walk through these phantom hills. But it was no lasting good, and as the days passed we realized that we must suffer this absurdity, for we could not do anything else. But of course it took it out of us. During these days the blisters on my fingers were very painful. Long before my hands were frostbitten, or indeed anything but cold, which was of course a normal thing, the matter inside these big blisters, which rose all down my fingers with only a skin between them, was frozen into ice. To handle the cooking gear or the food bags was agony, to start the primus was worse, and when one day I was able to prick 6 or 7 of the blisters after supper and let the liquid matter out, the relief was very great. Every night after that I treated such others as were ready in the same way, until they gradually disappeared. Sometimes it was difficult not to howl. I did want to howl many times, every hour of these days and nights, but I invented a formula instead, which I repeated to myself continually. Especially I remember it came in useful when at the end of the march, with my feet frostbitten, my heart beating slowly, my vitality at its lowest ebb, my body solid with cold, I used to seize the shovel and go on digging snow onto the tent skirting, while the cook inside was trying to light the primus. "You've got it in the neck, stick it, you've got it in the neck," was the refrain, and I wanted every little bit of encouragement it would give me. Then I would find myself repeating stick it, and then "you've got it in the neck." One of the joys of summer sledging is that you can let your mind wander thousands of miles away for weeks and weeks. Oates used to provision his little yacht. There was a pickled herring he was going to have. I invented the compactest little revolving bookcase, which was going to hold not books but pemmican and chocolate and biscuit and cocoa and sugar, and have a cooker on the top, and was going to stand always ready to quench my hunger when I got home. And we visited restaurants and theatres and grouse moors, and we thought of a pretty girl or girls, and... But now that was all impossible. Our conditions forced themselves upon us without pause. It was not possible to think of anything else. We got no respite. I found it best to refuse to let myself think of the past or the future, to live only for the job of the moment, and to compel myself to think only how to do it the most efficiently. Once you let yourself imagine. This day also, July 1st, we were harassed by a nasty little wind which blew in our faces. The temperature was -66°, and in such temperatures the effect of even the lightest airs is blighting, and immediately freezes any exposed part. But we all fitted the bits of windproof lined with fur which we had made in the hut across our balaclavas, in front of our noses, and these were of the greatest comfort. They formed other places upon which our breath could freeze, and the lower parts of our faces were soon covered with solid sheets of ice, which was in itself an additional protection. This was a normal and not uncomfortable condition during the journey. The hair on our faces kept the ice away from the skin, and for myself I would rather have the ice than be without it, until I want to get my balaclava off to drink my hoosh. We only made 2¼ miles, and it took 8 hours. It blew force 3 that night, with a temperature of –65.2°, and there was some drift. This was pretty bad, but luckily the wind dropped to a light breeze by the time we were ready to start the next morning, July 2nd. The temperature was then –60°, and continued so all day, falling lower in the evening. At 4 p.m. we watched a bank of fog form over the peninsula to our left, and noticed at the same time that our frozen mitts thawed out on our hands, and the outlines of the land as shown by the stars became obscured. We made 2½ miles with the usual relaying, and camped at 8 p.m. with the temperature –65°. It really was a terrible march, and parts of both my feet were frozen at lunch. After supper I pricked 6 or 7 of the worst blisters, and the relief was considerable. I have met with amusement people who say, "Oh, we had –50 temperatures in Canada, they didn't worry me," or "I've been down to –60 something in Siberia." And then you find that they had nice dry clothing, a nice night's sleep in a nice aired bed, and had just walked out after lunch for a few minutes from a nice warm hut or an overheated train, and they look back upon it as an experience to be remembered. Well, of course, as an experience of cold, this can only be compared to eating a vanilla ice with hot chocolate cream after an excellent dinner at Claridge's. But in our present state we began to look upon –50s as a luxury which we did not often get. That evening, for the first time, we discarded our naked candle in favour of the rising moon. We had started before the moon on purpose, but as we shall see she gave us little light. However, we owed our escape from a very sticky death to her on one occasion. It was a little later on, when we were among crevasses, with Terra above us but invisible, somewhere on our left, and the Barrier pressure on our right. We were quite lost in the darkness, and only knew that we were running downhill, the sledge almost catching our heels. There had been no light all day, clouds obscured the moon, we had not seen her since yesterday, and quite suddenly a little patch of clear sky drifted, as it were, over her face, and she showed us, 3 paces ahead, a great crevasse with just a shining icy lid not much thicker than glass. We should all have walked into it, and the sledge would certainly have followed us down. After that I felt we had a chance of pulling through. God could not be so cruel as to have saved us just to prolong our agony. But at present we need not worry about crevasses, for we had not reached the long stretch where the moving Barrier, with the weight of many 100 miles of ice behind it, comes butting up against the slopes of Mount Terror, itself some 11,000 feet high. Now we were still plunging ankle deep in the mass of soft sandy snow which lies in the windless area. It seemed to have no bottom at all, and since the snow was much the same temperature as the air, our feet as well as our bodies got colder and colder the longer we marched. In ordinary sledging you begin to warm up after a quarter of an hour's pulling. Here it was just the reverse. Even now I find myself unconsciously kicking the toes of my right foot against the heel of my left, a habit I picked up on this journey by doing it every time we halted. Well, no, not always, for there was one halt when we just lay on our backs and gazed up at the sky, where, so the others said, there was blazing the most wonderful aurora they had ever seen. I did not see it, being so near-sighted and unable to wear spectacles owing to the cold. The aurora was always before us as we travelled east, more beautiful than any seen by previous expeditions wintering in McMurdo Sound, where Erebus must have hidden the most brilliant displays. Now most of the sky was covered with swinging, swaying curtains, which met in a great whirl overhead, lemon yellow, green and orange. The minimum this night was –65°, and during July 3rd it ranged between –52 and –58°. We got forward only 2½ miles, and by this time I had silently made up my mind that we had not the ghost of a chance of reaching the penguins. I am sure that Bill was having a very bad time these nights, though it was an impression rather than anything else, for he never said so. We knew we did sleep, for we heard one another snore, and also we used to have dreams and nightmares, but we had little consciousness of it, and we were now beginning to drop off while we halted on the march. Our sleeping bags were getting really bad by now, and already it took a long time to thaw a way down into them at night. Bill spread his in the middle, Bowers was on his right, and I was on his left. Always he insisted that I should start getting my legs into mine before he started. We were rapidly cooling down after our hot supper, and this was very unselfish of him. Then came 7 shivering hours, and first thing on getting out of our sleeping bags in the morning we stuffed our personal gear into the mouth of the bag before it could freeze. This made a plug which, when removed, formed a frozen hole for us to push into as a start in the evening. We got into some strange knots when trying to persuade our limbs into our bags, and suffered terribly from cramp in consequence. We would wait and rub, but directly we tried to move again down it would come and grip our legs in a vice. We also, especially Bowers, suffered agony from cramp in the stomach. We let the primus burn on after supper now for a time. It was the only thing which kept us going. And when one who was holding the primus was seized with cramp, we hastily took the lamp from him until the spasm was over. It was horrible to see Birdie's stomach cramp sometimes. He certainly got it much worse than Bill or I. I suffered a lot from heartburn, especially in my bag at nights. We were eating a great proportion of fat, and this was probably the cause. Stupidly I said nothing about it for a long time. Later, when Bill found out, he soon made it better with the medical case. Birdie always lit the candle in the morning, so called, and this was an heroic business. Moisture collected on our matches if you looked at them. Partly I suppose it was bringing them from outside into a comparatively warm tent, partly from putting boxes into pockets in our clothing. Sometimes it was necessary to try 4 or 5 boxes before a match struck. The temperature of the boxes and matches was about 100 degrees of frost, and the smallest touch of the metal on naked flesh caused frostbite. If you wore mitts you could scarcely feel anything, especially since the tips of our fingers were already very callous. To get the first light going in the morning was beastly cold business, made worse by having to make sure that it was at last time to get up. Bill insisted that we must lie in our bags 7 hours every night. In civilization men are taken at their own valuation because there are so many ways of concealment, and there is so little time, perhaps even so little understanding. Not so down south. These 2 men went through the winter journey and lived. Later they went through the polar journey and died. They were gold, pure, shining, unalloyed. Words cannot express how good their companionship was. Through all these days, and those which were to follow, the worst I suppose in their dark severity that men have ever come through alive, no single hasty or angry word passed their lips. When, later, we were sure, so far as we can be sure of anything, that we must die, they were cheerful, and so far as I can judge their songs and cheery words were quite unforced. Nor were they ever flurried, though always as quick as the conditions would allow in moments of emergency. It is hard that often such men must go first when others far less worthy remain. There are those who write of polar expeditions as though the whole thing was as easy as possible. They are trusting, I suspect, in a public who will say, "What a fine fellow this is! We know what horrors he has endured, yet see how little he makes of all his difficulties and hardships." Others have gone to the opposite extreme. I do not know that there is any use trying to make a -18° temperature appear formidable to an uninitiated reader by calling it 50 degrees of frost. I want to do neither of these things. I am not going to pretend that this was anything but a ghastly journey, made bearable and even pleasant to look back upon by the qualities of my 2 companions who have gone. At the same time I have no wish to make it appear more horrible than it actually was. The reader need not fear that I am trying to exaggerate. During the night of July the 3rd the temperature dropped to -65°, but in the morning we wakened. We really did wake that morning, to great relief. The temperature was only -27, and the wind blowing some 15 miles an hour with steadily falling snow. It only lasted a few hours, and we knew it must be blowing a howling blizzard outside the windless area in which we lay, but it gave us time to sleep and rest and get thoroughly thawed and wet and warm inside our sleeping bags. To me at any rate this modified blizzard was a great relief, though we all knew that our gear would be worse than ever when the cold came back. It was quite impossible to march. During the course of the day the temperature dropped to -44°, during the following night to -54°. The soft new snow which had fallen made the surface the next day, July 5, almost impossible. We relayed as usual and managed to do 8 hours pulling, but we got forward only 1½ miles. The temperature ranged between -55 and -61°, and there was at one time a considerable breeze, the effect of which was paralysing. There was the great circle of a halo around the moon with a vertical shaft, and mock moons. We hoped that we were rising on to the long snow cape which marks the beginning of Mount Terror. That night the temperature was -75°, at breakfast -70, at noon nearly -77. The day lives in my memory as that on which I found out that records are not worth making. The thermometer, as swung by Bowers after lunch at 5:51 p.m, registered -77.5°, which is 109½ of frost, and is, I suppose, as cold as any one will want to endure in darkness and iced up gear and clothes. The lowest temperature recorded by a Discovery Spring Journey party was -67.7°, and in those days 14 days was a long time for a spring party to be away sledging, and they were in daylight. This was our 10th day out, and we hoped to be away for 6 weeks. Luckily we were spared wind. Our naked candle burnt steadily as we trudged back in our tracks to fetch our other sledge, but if we touched metal for a fraction of a second with naked fingers we were frostbitten. To fasten the strap buckles over the loaded sledge was difficult. To handle the cooker, or mugs or spoons, the primus or oil can was worse. How Bowers managed with the meteorological instruments I do not know, but the meteorological log is perfectly kept. Yet as soon as you breathed near the paper it was covered with a film of ice, through which the pencil would not bite. To handle rope was always cold, and in these very low temperatures dreadfully cold work. The toggling up of our harnesses to the sledge we were about to pull, the untoggling at the end of the stage, the lashing up of our sleeping bags in the morning, the fastening of the cooker to the top of the instrument box were bad, but not nearly so bad as the smaller lashings, which were now strings of ice. One of the worst was round the weekly food bag, and those round the pemmican, tea and butter bags inside were thinner still. But the real devil was the lashing of the tent door. It was like wire, and yet had to be tied tight. If you had to get out of the tent during the 7 hours spent in our sleeping bags, you must tie a string as stiff as a poker, and re-thaw your way into a bag already as hard as a board. Our paraffin was supplied at a flash point suitable to low temperatures, and was only a little milky. It was very difficult to splinter bits off the butter. The temperature that night was -75.8°, and I will not pretend that it did not convince me that Dante was right when he placed the circles of ice below the circles of fire. Still we slept sometimes, and always we lay for 7 hours. Again and again Bill asked us how about going back, and always we said no. Yet there was nothing I should have liked better. I was quite sure that to dream of Cape Crozier was the wildest lunacy. That day we had advanced 1½ miles by the utmost labour and the usual relay work. This was quite a good march, and Cape Crozier is 67 miles from Cape Evans. More than once in my short life I have been struck by the value of the man who is blind to what appears to be a common sense certainty. He achieves the impossible. We never spoke our thoughts. We discussed the age of stone which was to come, when we built our cosy warm rock hut on the slopes of Mount Terror, and ran our stove with penguin blubber, and pickled little emperors in warmth and dryness. We were quite intelligent people, and we must all have known that we were not going to see the penguins, and that it was folly to go forward. And yet, with quiet perseverance, in perfect friendship, almost with gentleness, those two men led on. I just did what I was told. It is desirable that the body should work, feed and sleep at regular hours, and this is too often forgotten when sledging. But just now we found we were unable to fit 8 hours marching and 7 hours in our sleeping bags into a 24-hour day. The routine camp work took more than 9 hours, such were the conditions. We therefore ceased to observe the quite imaginary difference between night and day, and it was noon on Friday, July 7th, before we got away. The temperature was -68°, and there was a thick white fog. Generally we had but the vaguest idea where we were, and we camped at 10 p.m. after managing 1¾ miles for the day. But what a relief! Instead of labouring away Our hearts were beating more naturally. It was easier to camp. We had some feeling in our hands, and our feet had not gone to sleep. Birdie swung the thermometer and found it only -55. Now if we tell people that to get only 87 degrees of frost can be an enormous relief, they simply won't believe us, I remember saying. Perhaps you won't, but it was, all the same. And I wrote that night, there is something after all rather good in doing something never done before. Things were looking up, you see. Our hearts were doing very gallant work. Towards the end of the march they were getting beaten and were finding it difficult to pump the blood out to our extremities. There were few days that Wilson and I did not get some part of our feet frostbitten. As we camped I suspect our hearts were beating comparatively slowly and weakly. Nothing could be done until a hot drink was ready. Tea for lunch, hot water for supper. Directly we started to drink, then the effect was wonderful. It was, said Wilson, like putting a hot water bottle against your heart. The beats became very rapid and strong, and you felt the warmth travelling outwards and downwards. Then you got your foot gear off, puttees cut in half and wound round the bottom of the trousers, finnesko, senegras, hair socks, and 2 pairs of woollen socks. Then you nursed back your feet and tried to believe you were glad. A frostbite does not hurt until it begins to thaw. Later came the blisters, and then the chunks of dead skin. Bill was anxious. It seems that Scott had twice gone for a walk with him during the winter, and tried to persuade him not to go, and only finally consented on condition that Bill brought us all back unharmed. We were southern journeymen. Bill had a tremendous respect for Scott, and later, when we were about to make an effort to get back home over the Barrier, and our case was very desperate, he was most anxious to leave no gear behind at Cape Crozier, even the scientific gear which could be of no use to us, and of which we had plenty more at the hut. "Scott will never forgive me if I leave gear behind," he said. It is a good sledging principle, and the party which does not follow it, or which leaves some of its load to be fetched in later, is seldom a good one. But it is a principle which can be carried to excess. And now Bill was feeling terribly responsible for both of us. He kept on saying that he was sorry, but he had never dreamed it was going to be as bad as this. He felt that having asked us to come he was in some way chargeable with our troubles. When leaders have this kind of feeling about their men they get much better results if the men are good. If men are bad, or even moderate, they will try and take advantage of what they consider to be softness. The temperature on the night of July 7th was -59°. On July 8th we found the first sign that we might be coming to an end of this soft, powdered, arrowrooty snow. It was frightfully hard pulling, but every now and then our finnesko pierced a thin crust before they sank right in. This meant a little wind, and every now and then our feet came down on a hard slippery patch under the soft snow. We were surrounded by fog which walked along with us, and far above us the moon was shining on its roof. Steering was as difficult as the pulling, and 4 hours of the hardest work only produced 1¼ miles in the morning, and 3 more hours 1 mile in the afternoon, and the temperature was -57 with a breeze. Horrible. In the early morning of the next day snow began to fall, and the fog was dense. When we got up we could see nothing at all anywhere. After the usual 4 hours to get going in the morning, we settled that it was impossible to relay, for we should never be able to track ourselves back to the second sledge. It was with very great relief that we found we could move both sledges together, and I think this was mainly due to the temperature, which had risen to -36°. This was our 4th day of fog, in addition to the normal darkness, and we knew we must be approaching the land. It would be Terror Point, and the fog is probably caused by the moist, warm air coming up from the sea through the pressure cracks and crevasses, for it is supposed that the Barrier here is afloat. I wish I could take you on to the Great Ice Barrier some calm evening, when the sun is just dipping in the middle of the night, and show you the autumn tints on Ross Island. A last look round before turning in, a good day's march behind, enough fine fat pemmican inside you to make you happy, the homely smell of tobacco from the tent, a pleasant sense of soft fur and deep sleep to come, and all the softest colours God has made are in the snow, on Erebus to the west where the wind can scarcely move his cloud of smoke, and on Terror to the east, not so high and more regular in form. How peaceful and dignified it all is. That was what you might have seen 4 months ago had you been out on the Barrier Plain. Low down on the extreme right or east of the land there was a black smudge of rock peeping out from the great snowdrifts. That was the Knoll, and close under it were the cliffs of Cape Crozier. The Knoll, looking quite low, and the cliffs invisible, although they are 800 feet high, a sheer precipice falling into the sea. End of chapter 7, part 2.